Let's continue our discussion on genetics. We're going to look at dominant and recessive traits and how they can be passed on through the generations. This is known as pedigree analysis, and next week in lab you'll be doing pedigree analysis. So we can see on our diagram that mom here has two recessive alleles. She has a recessive phenotype that is expressed. Dad has a dominant allele, and then we don't know where his other allele is. Dad has the dominant phenotype. So dad could be homozygous dominant, or dad could be heterozygous. We just don't know. We haven't performed a genetic test on dad. But we do know that since mom has the recessive disease, every single one of her offspring is going to receive the recessive allele. So from this mother, this female receives a recessive allele, and this female receives a recessive allele. By the way, when we look at pedigrees, circles stand for females, squares stand for, ooh, I got that totally mixed up. Can you tell that I've been in the office since 8 this morning? I really need to go home and get some sleep. So circles stand for females, and then squares stand for males. So mom passes on a recessive allele to each of her what? Sons or daughters? Daughters. Mom has 2 little girls, her 2 little princesses. And then they marry their princes. And those princes that they marry do not have the disease being expressed. And they're in kind of the same situation that their father was. Their dad did not have the disease, but we don't know his genotype. Now, because these 2 little girls did not have the disease, but their mother had the disease, we can automatically assume that they are heterozygotes. They must be, because mom can only pass on the recessive allele, and if they don't have the disease, that means they have a dominant allele from dad, masking the recessive disease phenotype. Questions?
Some examples of those diseases.
Hemophilia is a good example of an autosomal recessive disease. Hemophilia is when you have a hard time clotting your blood. Your blood clots very slowly, and you're very likely to bleed to death. Now, these kiddos reproduce, and this little girl has another little girl. And because this little girl does not have the disease trait being expressed, we know that she absolutely has at least one dominant allele. This little girl has two boys and a girl. She has 3 kids. We don't necessarily know what's going on with these people, this son and this daughter, and they aren't necessarily part of what we're analyzing. We do know they did not have the disease trait. Now, this is kind of a bad situation that we have right here. In this situation, we have cousins breeding with each other.
I saw that.
And this is a primary reason why incestuous relationships are generally speaking frowned upon. Because incestuous relationships have a way of magnifying and amplifying recessive disease traits within offspring. So because cousin A and cousin B, so this young lady and this young man, they decided to have an incestuous relationship. They reproduced. They had 3 kids. And 2 of them expressed the recessive disease trait that their great-grandmother had. So great-grandma had the disease, but because she wasn't incestuous, her kiddos didn't have the disease. But when you have incest from multiple generations, you tend to magnify the disease traits. You tend to go from a heterozygous state to a homozygous state, either homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive. When you work in genetics and you're trying to breed fruit flies, for example, that are homozygous, you just have them breed with each other for multiple generations, and they either become homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive. Another way of looking at that is that they are a pure breeding line. Now, let's stop talking about mom and dad as humans. Let's talk about mom and dad as a purebred Dalmatian, or mom and dad as a true breeding Labrador Retriever mix. When you have a purebred dog, that purebred dog, that Labrador, can only breed with other Labradors to produce a purebred Labrador. Purebred dogs are incestuous dogs, and they tend to magnify homozygous recessive disease states and tend to be really sick and frail. Same thing with purebred racehorses as well, because it's generation after generation of incest to get the pure breeding line. So if you want a healthy pet, go to the pound, get a mutt, because they have more genetic diversity and they're less likely to express the homozygous recessive trait. The benefit of a pure breeding dog line is appearance. You know, there's the one specific trait that makes it that breed. For example, if you really love black and white spots, then get a purebred Dalmatian. If you love a healthy dog, get a mutt.
Because you're talking about hip dysplasia, heart disease, Addison's disease, heart failure.
Lots of different diseases.
Yep.
Common genetic defects for purebred Chihuahuas include non-closure of the frontal fontanelle. So a purebred line Chihuahua, generally speaking, will have a hole in the top of their skull that you can push out to their brain with. Purebred English Bulldogs, generally speaking, have their nasal cavity closed off. They cannot breathe through their nose. Yeah. There are all kinds of genetic defects that manifest in purebred lines of animals.
Huskies are the hip dysplasia.
Oh, purebred Huskies have hip dysplasia?
That, and I don't know the other stuff because they won't tell us because we don't buy anymore.
Yeah.
Because we've lost one.
So in other words, if you pony up the money for a purebred dog or a purebred animal, you will also be ponying up a lot of money for vet costs.
Right. But we got a Shiba Inu, and we paid $2,500 for hip surgery.
I believe that.
Pulsating patella surgery.
My dad grew up on a farm, and he had a very different approach to sick optional animals.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
So, that was an autosomal recessive disorder. Autosomal recessive disorders are the big reason why you don't have incest. Let's talk about autosomal dominant disorders. Autosomal dominant disorders are always going to be manifested whether or not you're a homozygote or a heterozygote for that specific allele. So, let's say mom and dad both have freckles. So instead of saying disease, let's go, something benign like freckles. Mom and dad both have freckles, and they reproduce. 2 of their kids have freckles. 2 of the kids do not have freckles. Because these 2 kids do not have freckles, you automatically know they are homozygous recessive for the recessive trait. And then this little girl reproduces with a young man who does not have freckles. So if 2 people that are homozygous recessive for the trait reproduce, their children can only be homozygous recessive for the trait. However, this young man over here reproduces, and when he reproduces, some of his kids have freckles and some of his kids don't have freckles. And because a couple of his children do not have freckles, that means this child had to inherit all recessive allele from this parent. So we can fill in that lowercase a. So autosomal dominant disorders for generic things like freckles or hair color are kind of fun. But there are also autosomal dominant diseases out there, and those are terrifying because there's a very good chance they will be expressed in the next generation. On the flip side, autosomal dominant diseases, because they're so strongly expressed, are selectively bred against very strongly. And I mean this with all tact, but if somebody has an autosomal dominant disease being expressed, generally speaking, their chances of reproducing are much smaller than someone who's not expressing the disease state. For example, cystic fibrosis, which is actually a recessive disease, but if somebody has cystic fibrosis or another disease, potentially an autosomal dominant disease, if they have that disease state, many times that means they die sooner and have less time to make babies and pass on that bad gene. Questions? In terms of impact, class, I have a question for you. What has a bigger impact, an autosomal dominant or an autosomal recessive disease? The dominant. Autosomal dominant diseases. Yes. Incest is bad because it magnifies autosomal recessive diseases. So let's talk about some specific diseases that are out there. Tay-Sachs disease is an autosomal recessive disorder where somebody doesn't have the ability to break down specific fatty acid proteins. Cystic fibrosis is another autosomal recessive disease. And in this disease, the person's chloride ion transporters are breaking down, and they end up with extra thick mucus build up in their lungs that causes them to die of premature death, typically from pneumonia. If someone has PKU, phenylketonuria, they have a specific enzyme they lack that helps them to process or metabolize an amino acid. And because they cannot process or metabolize that amino acid, their nervous system development is impaired. Sickle cell anemia is an autosomal recessive disorder that causes the red blood cells to be deformed, and instead of having that nice biconcave shape, they're shaped like bananas or sickles and tend to clog the blood capillaries. So here in Tay-Sachs disease, instead of having a healthy lysosome, individuals that have Tay-Sachs disease have abnormally large lysosomes, and those abnormally large lysosomes can clog the axon and minimize axonal transport within the axon of motor neurons. Let's talk about some of these scary ones. These diseases are not as common. The reason autosomal dominant diseases are not as common is because, generally speaking, they kill you off before you can reproduce and pass them on. So if we look at autosomal recessive diseases, these you can trace from generation to generation using the pedigrees. Autosomal dominant disorders usually spontaneously appear within a generation. And then once they spontaneously appear, usually they stop at that individual. Very rarely are they passed on to the next generation. So we have Marfan syndrome. Someone who has Marfan syndrome doesn't have proper elastin production in their body. Their connective tissue that is stretchy is going to be malfunctioning. Consequently, their lenses of their eyes become dislocated within their eyes, so they can't focus their eyes. They have abnormally long fingers. They have a caved-in chest, and the wall of their aorta is weakened and likely to burst from a lack of proper connective tissues. If somebody has osteogenesis imperfecta, they have imperfect creation of bone in their bodies. In other words, they have super duper brittle bones. If somebody has Huntington disease, this particular protein, the Huntington protein, has too many repeating glutamine sequence residues in it. And when that protein becomes misshapen by having the inappropriate number of glutamine amino acids in it, that causes the protein to become non-functional and leads to progressive degeneration of the central nervous system. So if we look at these autosomal recessive disorders, I'm willing to bet you probably know at least one person that has one of these 4 autosomal recessive diseases. They're that common. I happen to have known 2 people that have had cystic fibrosis and 1 person that has dealt with sickle cell anemia. So these autosomal recessive disorders, generally speaking, are going to be more common because they're going to be passed on as when a parent is a carrier for the disease. These autosomal dominant disorders are much less common. I do not know any individuals who have suffered from any of these diseases. Do you? So if we look at Marfan syndrome in particular, in summary, nothing works. But more specifically, the connective tissues that are needed for the skeleton to form don't form. So there's going to be skeletal issues. There's going to be the connective tissues in the heart don't function properly. The connective tissues in the eyes, the lungs, and the skin all don't function appropriately. If somebody has Huntington's disease, instead of having a nice high concentration of neurons in the brain, they are going to have excessive neuronal death, and that excessive neuronal death leads to mental retardation and early death. If somebody has cystic fibrosis, they have too many chloride ions on the intracellular side of their mucous cells and not enough chloride ions outside, and that causes extra thick mucus because of the osmotic gradient that develops. And then finally, if somebody has cystic fibrosis, to treat cystic fibrosis, oftentimes they're given a nebulizer to help loosen the mucus in their lungs, and they're given a vibrator, a percussive chest or vest that physically vibrates their lungs to shake the mucus out. Another genetic we can now perform genetic diagnosis of these diseases before implantation has occurred. Implantation is when the blastula implants in the endometrium of the female's uterus. For some individuals, this is the definition of pregnancy, when pregnancy has occurred. Now, if you are performing in vitro fertilization, let's say you're going through reproductive therapy, you can harvest a few cells from that embryo and test those cells for the genetic disease. So you can diagnose the disease before implantation has occurred in the woman's uterus. This is not going to happen naturally all by itself. If left to its own devices, generally speaking, the blastula will implant in the endometrium. For this to occur, for pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to occur, it must be done with in vitro fertilization therapies. So where the sperm and the egg are being combined in a test tube. And then several rounds of cell division occur in that test tube. So the zygote starts to divide. It forms the morula, and then it forms the blastula, and you can harvest a couple cells. When this is done, generally speaking, parents will opt to only have embryos without the genetic disorder implanted in the mother's endometrium. So they are producing children that do not have the disease or are not carriers for the disease. So in this situation, you can have take the embryo that's in a piece of in the test tube, harvest a cell from it, and then test it. And if that cell comes back genetically healthy, the rest of the embryo can be implanted and result in a healthy baby. Or you can harvest an egg from mom and then mix that with a sperm from dad that's been pre-screened, or a sperm donor from a biologically healthy father that is not a carrier for the disease. And then with a sperm donor, you can create a healthy embryo that's implanted to give you a healthy kiddo. You can also test the mother's egg. For some individuals, they don't want to create an embryo to potentially destroy an embryo. For a large segment of the population, they believe human life begins at conception. And they're morally opposed to this particular method, where they create an embryo and then would potentially destroy the embryo if it has the disease state present. So an alternative is to harvest an egg from mom. And think back to a couple chapters ago when we talked about mitosis and meiosis. When that egg is forming, it's going through the rounds of meiosis, it will eject some polar bodies. Those polar bodies that are ejected are going to be small packets of genetic information that can be tested to look at the genetics of the mother's egg. And you can test the polar body to determine the genome of the egg, and then get around the ethical dilemma that some people have of creating an embryo to potentially destroy the embryo. Questions? This method, though, if the father is the carrier for the genetic disease, does not work. If the if the dad is the carrier of the genetic disease, the only way to have pre-implantation testing is to create an embryo and then test the embryo. So for those couples where the father carries the disease and the couple is morally opposed to potentially creating an embryo to destroy the embryo, the only way around their conundrum is to have a sperm donor from a healthy male that's not carrying the disease. Any questions about this last slide? All right. So, concept check, guys. Which disease would have the highest prevalence in a population? And let's assume there's no selective breeding going on. So everyone looks the same and you aren't going to be worried about cooties or life expectancy.
Recessive one, autosomal recessive.
The highest frequency. So it depends on your line of thought. We could have either autosomal dominant or autosomal recessive. If we ignore lifespans and assume everyone lives the same length and produces the same number of offspring, then autosomal dominant diseases would have the highest prevalence. But if we take into account life expectancy and attractiveness to a potential mate, then autosomal recessive becomes more common. Because generally speaking, someone who has an autosomal dominant disease doesn't live that long and is less attractive to a potential mate. So they would produce fewer offspring. Questions? Did that explanation make sense? Okie dokie. Let's talk about polygenic traits. These polygenic traits are traits that are coded for by more than one gene. They need multiple sets of alleles to cover the same trait. Common examples of polygenic traits that are in every textbook that talks about polygenic traits are skin color and height of the person. And the more genes that code for the polygenic trait, the more fluid the variation in phenotypes that we're going to have. We can also have a multifactorial trait. A multifactorial trait is influenced by both the genotype and the environmental exposure the person is given. A good example is how our height can be affected by nutrition, skin color by sun exposure, so on and so forth. So, if we look at our height, Human height is controlled by 3 different genes working together. If somebody receives all recessive alleles for all 3 genes, they're homozygous recessive for each of the 3 genes, they're going to be on the super duper short, or they'll be on one end of the spectrum. As we look at their skin color, if they inherit all dominant alleles for all 3 genes, so they're homozygous dominant 3 times over, they are going to have super duper dark skin. If 2 parents that have brown skin reproduce, those parents are typically going to be heterozygotes for those traits. And it's theoretically possible that 2 brown-skinned parents could produce a black-skinned offspring. It's unlikely, but possible. It's much more likely that a brown-skinned parent would produce another brown-skinned offspring. But it's also theoretically possible that a brown-skinned parent could produce a fair-skinned child. Now, if we had 2 black-skinned parents reproducing with each other, so each parent is homozygous dominant for all 3 alleles, what is their child going to be? The same allele type. Because each parent would only have dominant alleles to pass on, the child can only receive dominant alleles and therefore would have the dark skin. Conversely, if 2 extremely fair-skinned parents reproduced, those 2 parents would have all recessive alleles for all 3 genes and could only pass on recessive alleles to their children, and their children could only have fair skin.
One was 3, and one was in the...
So if we had a parent from number 3 category and a parent from number 0 category,
Yeah,
generally speaking, you'd get some kind of a blending between the 2.
that makes sense. Okay.
And the same is true for human height. There are multiple genes that code for human height. Most individuals are going to be in the high frequency category, but some people inherit a lot of the dominant alleles, some people inherit a lot of the recessive alleles, so there's a gradient that occurs. And this gradient is also influenced by gender as well. In this figure, females are wearing black, males are wearing navy blue. Generally speaking, females are shorter than males, but there can be exceptions. This female over here is 6'0". Now for a male, that's not that uncommon, but for a female, I mean, she is an outlier. It is very uncommon for a woman to be 6 feet tall. It's much more common if we look at the female columns here. The one that's the most frequent is the 5'6" column. For a woman to be 5'6" tall is relatively common. Conversely, at the extreme end of the spectrum for the males, it's possible for these guys to be 6'5", or if it's a really short male, it's possible for him to be 5'4". Well, there was only a certain sample size they were working with. If you increase your sample size, these curves become smoother.
Okay.
Or these histograms, I should say. Sometimes environmental factors throughout the year are going to influence the expression of a specific gene. For example, many animals can change their fur color between summer and winter. A good example is a Himalayan rabbit. As the temperature fluctuations are exposed, as this rabbit is exposed to temperature fluctuations or varying amounts of sunlight, specific genes can be activated or deactivated in its body. We also have an incomplete dominance. This is not a dominant or recessive. This is more of a blending of the traits. So if you have someone with curly hair, reproduce with someone with straight hair, their children or child would have wavy hair. It's not completely straight, not completely curly, it's something in between. Another way of looking at this is you had someone with a flower that has red petals reproduce with a flower that has yellow petals. They could blend the traits together and produce orange flowers in the next generation. A disease I'd like to highlight for you is hypercholesterolemia. Hypercholesterolemia is when somebody has two mutated alleles for the LDL receptors in their bodies. LDL is low-density lipoprotein, and we use low-density lipoproteins to transport cholesterol to the tissues of our bodies. When we have HDL, that's when we're transporting cholesterol to the liver to be excreted in the bile, to leave the body, so that's considered good cholesterol. Now, if our mutated alleles are present, that person doesn't have the ability to receive and process low-density lipoproteins that are present in their bloodstream. And consequently, those low-density lipoproteins start to build up in clumps and accumulate in the body, as opposed to being processed. And oftentimes, they will be visible as large lumps underneath the skin. Now, if somebody has only one bad allele for this dihybrid trait, or this trait that's controlled by two genes, they will have a normal amount of LDL in their blood plasma. If they're a heterozygote for the disease, or they have one of the possible two bad alleles, they have an increase in blood cholesterol, LDL concentrations, and if they're a homozygote, they have sky-high LDL concentrations in terms of milligrams per deciliter of blood. And if they're a homozygote for the disease, they have large fatty deposits build up of LDL in their skin. Let's talk about codominance. Codominance is when two traits are expressed at the same time. The classic examples in every textbook for codominance is blood typing. So two alleles can be dominant at the same time. They do not blend together, but they'll always be expressed over the recessive allele. For example, if someone who has type A blood reproduces with someone who has type B blood, it's possible for a dominant A allele and a dominant B allele to be passed on, and the child to have blood type AB. That happens all the time. We also are going to have multiple allele inheritance. If we look at blood type in particular, there are 3 alleles for blood type. There's the A, B, and O alleles. And this is ignoring the rhesus factor entirely. So, A and B are always dominant. They exhibit codominance with each other. And the O is the recessive allele. O will always be masked by either A or either B. So if a parent has blood type O, and that parent reproduces with another O blood type, their children can only have O blood types. On the other hand, if a parent has an A and a B allele, they have the AB blood type, and they reproduce with someone who is an O blood type, which means they have the 2 recessive O alleles, those offspring would either inherit a dominant B or a dominant A allele. So all the offspring will either be blood type A or blood type B. But they would be heterozygotes because they would also inherit the recessive O alleles from the other parent. So here are the possible genotypes. You can have A and B, you can have B and O, you can have A and O, or you can have O and O. And actually we omitted a few. We could also have A and B and B. If someone has the dominant A and B alleles, they have type AB blood. if someone has 2 dominant A's, oh, I drew my arrow to the wrong spot. If someone has 2 dominant A alleles, they would have type A blood. If they have 2 dominant B alleles, they would have type B blood. If they have 1 dominant B allele, they would have type B blood. If they have 1 dominant A, they would have type A. And if they have 2 recessive O's, they have type O. Now, in this particular scenario, mom and dad are both heterozygotes. And because mom and dad are both heterozygotes, these last 2 options are not possible for the offspring. The only way you could have type O blood is if each of your parents has at least 1 O allele. So if both of your parents are type O blood, then you will absolutely have type O blood. But let's say your dad is a type B. He could have a dominant B allele expressed and a masked recessive O allele he could pass on to you. So when we look at blood typing, the sperm, we typically are going to use a placeholder to represent the gene, and then a superscript to represent this specific allele. We use the placeholder superscript system when there are more than 2 possible alleles of the same gene. So dad could pass on the B allele, or he could pass on the recessive O allele. I've sometimes seen this abbreviated as a capital I with an O superscripted on it as well. So, concept check class. Is it possible for a man and a woman that have tan skin to have a child with very dark or very fair skin? Yes, it absolutely is. It happens every now and again. I quick Googled black parents, white baby, and came up with this example that was in the news. This happened a couple of years ago, where 2 individuals that are very clearly of African descent had someone with very fair skin. Let's talk about sex-linked inheritance. For these sex-linked traits, these are going to be traits that are associated with the sex chromosomes. They'll be on either the X chromosome or the Y chromosome. For X-linked inheritance, those are correspondingly carried on our X chromosome. Y-linked inheritance is carried on the Y chromosome. So, here's a quick pop quiz. Who is more likely to exhibit a Y-linked disease, a male or a female? The male, because only males receive Y chromosomes. How about an X-linked disease? Who is more likely to exhibit an X-linked disease, a male or a female? A male. Why a male, Alyssa? You are correct. Males only get 1 X chromosome. So whether it's a dominant disease or a recessive disease, because they only have 1 chromosome, that trait will always be expressed on the X chromosome. Females receive 2 X chromosomes. So if it is a recessive X-linked disease, it's possible for the female to inherit a dominant allele on their other X chromosome to mask the disease state. So in other words, when it comes to gender-linked diseases, males get shafted. So let's look at an X-linked disease that's really common. Color blindness. How many of you know a colorblind female? I don't know any. How many of you know a colorblind male? It's super duper common. Are you colorblind, Austin? Okay, you're nodding your head so much. Yeah, it's super common. So, color blindness is linked to the X chromosome, and it is a recessive disease. Let's look at mom. Mom is a carrier for color blindness. She has 1 bad copy of the allele. But because she has a good copy of it, a dominant copy, she does not express the disease type. She is not colorblind. Dad is also not colorblind as well. When dad reproduces, he can pass on his good X chromosome, or his Y chromosome to the offspring. When mom reproduces, she can pass on a good X chromosome or a bad X chromosome. Now the offspring has two X chromosomes. That offspring is female. So this female and this female are not colorblind because they have at least one dominant allele. This male, the XY, is not colorblind because he received the dominant allele from mom. But this male is colorblind because he received the bad allele from mom. So if mom is a carrier for the color blindness, there is a 50% chance that her male offspring will be colorblind. If mom is colorblind, there is a 100% chance that her male offspring will be colorblind. If mom is colorblind, there's only a 50% chance that the daughter will be, assuming the dad is not. Sure.
Are most inherited diseases, do they get expressed always with a recessive allele? Because it seems like most of that is. Or is that just how we organize it?
Are most inherited diseases recessive-based diseases? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Yes. And that's generally because they can be masked for a couple generations. So I'm willing to bet everyone in this room has at least one recessive disease that you're a carrier for, depending on the specific disease. But since it's a recessive disease, you're not manifesting that disease trait. And you're going to be capable of living a healthy lifespan and reproducing, have plenty of babies, and pass that out, your genetics on to the next generation. When someone has a dominant disease, that disease manifests itself 100% of the time. And that usually causes them to die off pretty quickly or not reproduce that much. Ashley.
Can autoimmune diseases be passed on?
Yes. So if we look at a pedigree for an X-linked disorder, we can see that grandma is not colorblind, but grandpa is colorblind. And grandpa reproduces, and one of his daughters is a carrier for color blindness. And then this daughter reproduces, and then one of her children will be colorblind as a result. And because grandpa is the carrier for color blindness, if grandpa has a son, that son had to get the Y chromosome from grandpa and a good X chromosome from mom. So the son is not a carrier. But the son reproduced with a colorblind woman. So if there's a colorblind woman, 100% of the male offspring are going to be colorblind. In addition to colorblindness, other common X-linked disorders include Duchenne muscular dystrophy, Fragile X syndrome, and hemophilia. Duchenne muscular dystrophy is characterized by a wasting of the skeletal muscle fibers and replacing them with non-contractile fibrous tissue. Fragile X syndrome is going to be a condition that causes the individual to become cognitively or mentally impaired early on in their lifespan. And then hemophilia is an X-linked disorder that causes that individual to not have the appropriate blood clotting proteins. And they're much more likely to bleed out. So here's a young man who has Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It's worth emphasizing that individuals that have Duchenne muscular dystrophy have large-looking muscles. They have a lot of hypertrophy of the muscles. That hypertrophy, though, is not from an increase in skeletal muscle tissue mass. It's from an increase in fibrous tissue mass. So their skeletal muscle fibers die off, and then the muscle itself bulks up with excessive connective and fibrous tissues that do not contract. For someone who has Duchenne muscular dystrophy, the more they work their muscles, the quicker those muscles will die off muscular cells will die off and be replaced with fibrous tissue. So when someone has Duchenne muscular dystrophy, they have excessive hypertrophy of the muscles of the legs, and consequently, those muscles of the legs are the first ones that will run out of skeletal muscle fibers, because those are the ones that are used most frequently. Here is the royal pedigree. It used to be very common a couple hundred years ago for royalty to only breed with royalty. You didn't want to be that common pleasant blood in your family line. And consequently, it was very common for royalty to be inbred. Yes, cousins reproducing with cousins. So if we look at this family tree, we notice there's a little bit of branching out, and then they come back together again. Now, in terms of genetics, the rule of thumb is the chances of a homozygous recessive disease being expressed with a second cousin is so high that in most states it's illegal to marry a second cousin. But the chances of a homozygous recessive disease being expressed with a third cousin is low enough that in most states in the United States it is legal to marry a third cousin. And let's get real. How many of us know any of our third cousins off the top of our head? You are the exception. I don't know a single one of my third cousins.
Go down to my eights.
That's nuts. An eighth cousin? Yeah, my family tree are not that detailed at all.
It's because you're...
So usually for most people, they just go based off of the last name and make sure they try to marry somebody who doesn't have the same last name.
Right.
So, guys, gals, concept check. When gender, or which gender, is most oftenly going to have a sex-linked disease, and why? What was that, Ashley?
Male.
Males, yes, the male gender. And why the male gender?
The male stuff. I figured out. I think the marriage carries the thingamajigger.
Yes, because of the male thingamajigger.
Sorry.
Let's be more precise. Austin, take it away.
They only have one on the thing. They only have one X.
And only one Y chromosome.
Phone.
So males only have one copy of each sex chromosome. So they will always express the homozygous recessive disease 100% of the time. And that is all we have for chapter 21 on genetics and inheritance.